Hello, Isaac here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Now, this is part 3 of a series going through Josephus' book Against Apion. If you're one of the lucky few that has been following the whole of this series, then please do let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But otherwise, please do subscribe to keep track of future uploads. So, in the last episode, we saw how Josephus provided evidence for Judean antiquity and Phoenician and Babylonian records, with addition to Greek. Now, in this episode, he'll respond to his critics, and we'll see him reply to libels against the Jewish nation, particularly in relation to the Exodus account. After his introduction explaining the origins of this slander and Egyptian hatred and envy, he writes, "It was the Egyptians who initiated the slanders against us, and certain people who wanted to gratify them attempted to twist the truth, neither admitting the arrival of our ancestors in Egypt as it actually took place, nor truthfully recounting the Exodus. They had many reasons for hate and envy, originally because our ancestors held sway over their land, and when they moved from their homeland, again prospered." Josephus therefore begins by reporting an Exodus legend from Manetho, to which he offers a lengthy rebuttal. Then Chaeremon's version is paraphrased and critiqued, before a third version from Lysimachus is given an equally short treatment. So, let's begin. Now, we've already seen how Manetho provided the first story of the Hyksos, those foreign rulers over Egypt, who probably ruled from around 630 to 523 BC. But this Hyksos were thrown out of Egypt, and according to Manetho at least, they would occupy Jerusalem. Josephus endorsed his account of the Hyksos, in part as he believed that it somewhat tallied with the records of his own people and the Exodus. But then Manetho, for Josephus, mixes this story up with an implausible story. For Manetho says that the Judeans were condemned to exile by the Egyptians because they were a crowd of lepers and other polluted people. In fact, this second exodus of lepers happens much later, some 200 years after the expulsion of the Hyksos, under the reign of Amenhotep. This is likely Amenhotep III, who reigned somewhere between 1391 and 1353. According to Manetho, this pharaoh desired to see God, but to do so he was told that he had to cleanse the whole land of lepers and other polluted people. And so he supposedly put 80,000 of them to work in stone quarries east of the Nile, and then later transferred them to the city of Avaris, the former capital of the Hyksos, which had been deserted after they had left. Josephus writes, quoting Manetho, "When a considerable time had elapsed for those doing hard labour in the quarries, they begged the king that he set apart for them a place for rest and shelter, and he granted them the city of Avaris, by then deserted by the shepherds. This city, according to religious law, is from the earliest times Typhonian. When they had entered this city and having this site as a base for revolt, they appointed as their leader one of the Heliopolitan priests called a Saurasiph, and took an oath that they would be obedient to him in everything. This people, therefore, after being transferred to Avaris, appointed as their ruler a priest of Heliopolis named a Saurasiph, and he would enact a set of rules forbidding the worship of the Egyptian gods, as well as to attach themselves to one another, and not to abstain from consuming those animals designated as sacred in Egypt. And he would ultimately fortify the city of Avaris and direct them to prepare for war with the pharaoh. Moreover, he sends ambassadors to Jerusalem to seek aid of the Hyksos and request for them to unite in a joint expedition against Egypt. The Hyksos agreed and came to their assistance with an army of 200,000 men. Nonetheless, Amenhotep didn't engage with this force, but escaped with his army to Ethiopia, where he remained for 13 years. During that time, Saurasiph ravaged Egypt, burning cities and villages and destroying the images of the gods, as well as eating sacred animals and expelling the priests. Manetho also tells us that during this period, Osiris changed his name in accordance with his change of religious allegiance, and he changed it to none other than Moses. But finally, after 13 years, Amenhotep returned to Egypt with a great force, and his son Ramesses with another. As Josephus writes, summarizing Manetho, he says Amenhotep in the 13th year, for that was the period destined for his banishment, advanced from Ethiopia with a large army, attacked the shepherds and the defiled people, defeated them in battle, and slaughtered many of them after pursuing them to the borders of Syria. Therefore Amenhotep defeated Moses and his army, and whilst many were killed, others were pursued to the bounds of Syria, and from there they presumably escaped to Judea. Now Josephus questions the logic of this story on many levels, from why the king granted them the city of Avaris in the first place if he wished to dispel these disfigured people from the land, to why the supposed Hyksos of Jerusalem would risk coming to the aid of a people who were their former enemies and physically disfigured, since Manetho tells us that this leprous people were Egyptian, and therefore they had no ethnic or cultural ties to the Hyksos. He also questions how any of these sick and disfigured people could even have survived after a long time in the stone quarries and in subsequent battles. But last of all, if Moses and his cohort were leprous, Josephus wonders why he enacted laws in the Torah which put strict limits on those with skin diseases and leprosy. According to Josephus, if Moses and his people had this affliction, he would have shown consideration and benevolence towards them in the Mosaic law. For example, the laws in Leviticus 13-14 on minor skin diseases instructed that the polluted person is to be banished from the camp or tabernacle, and that they must be examined by the priest and follow certain rites and purifications before they can enter the holy city again. In fact, Moses did not even allow in Leviticus 21 those whose bodies were mutilated, even to the slightest degree, to serve as priests. Therefore, as he states, how then is it likely that he would lay down such rules that those who have been brought together by such misfortunes would accept laws composed against themselves, bringing them disgrace and harm? Therefore, the largest part of Josephus' response here is to counter the claim that Moses and his cohort were leprous and diseased people who were eventually exiled from Egypt. For this is the same issue which arises in Chaeremon and Lysimachus, as we shall see next. Now, to begin with, Chaeremon was a leading Alexandrian intellectual who is listed among the Alexandrian delegates to Caligula in Rome after the riots of 38 AD. He was also an early tutor of Nero and therefore must have exercised considerable influence on Roman power in disseminating Egyptian ideas about the Judeans. When it comes to his Exodus account, Chaeremon puts forward the same king as Manetho, Amenhotep III, and his apparent son Ramesses. According to this account, Isis appeared to Amenhotep in his sleep, blaming him for the fact that the temple had been destroyed in the war. And the sacred scribe Phrixobautus said that if he purged Egypt of those who had impurities, he would find relief from this terror. Thus, 250,000 Egyptians were rounded up and expelled not to Avaris, but to Pelusium on the border of Egypt. Again, they were led by Moses, but also someone called Iosipus. And they joined with 380,000 people, not from Jerusalem, but in Pelusium itself, and then marched against Egypt. As Manetho, Amenhotep fled to Ethiopia, but according to Chaeremon, Amenhotep leaves his wife behind in Egypt, who in the meantime gives birth to their son Ramesses. And it is Ramesses, and not Amenhotep, who drives the Judeans out of Egypt into Syria. Ramesses then brought his father, Amenhotep, back from Ethiopia. Now, there are clear crossovers between the accounts of Chaeremon and Manetho, namely that the pharaoh Amenhotep sent lepers from all of Egypt to a city to cleanse the land. Then, They joined with others in an uprising led by Moses, but were eventually defeated and exiled to Syria. But there are a number of differences in the details, and Josephus holds that these differences show that there is no underlying truth in the account. For he says that those who conduct lies do not write what agrees with others, but fabricate what they like. This comes back to the historiography of Josephus. For he holds that true history is true history if everyone both says and writes the same thing about the same events. Problem though, for Josephus, is that the witnesses he himself brought forward from Egyptian, Chaldean, Phoenician and Greek records previously to prove the antiquity of the Judeans also contradicted the biblical record on certain details. But I guess, for Josephus, he would hold that the biblical account is of supreme authority when it comes to providing a true history. Next, he refers to Lysimachus, who Josephus says takes as his foundation the same lies about the lepers and the disfiguration, but surpasses them in the implausibility of his fabrications, which have clearly been concocted out of his profound enmity. Again, for Lysimachus, there is a story of a group of Judean people who suffered leprosy, scabies, and other diseases who are rounded up. But this happens under King Pacorus, which is much later, as he is the king of the 24th dynasty of Egypt, and he expels them in response to an oracle of Amun about the crop failure that had happened. God told him to purge these lepers so that the land could be fruitful again, for these lepers were taking refuge in the temples to beg for food, but this had led to many people contracting the disease, causing a crop failure. But in any case, he instructed some lepers to be wrapped up in lead sheets to sink them in the sea, and others to be sent out to a desert location to die. But those who were sent out to a desert location found a leader in Moses who advised them to risk taking a straight course until they reached an inhabited territory. And despite the considerable difficulties, this people came to Judea, where they founded a city known as Jerusalem and settled in it. Again though, the problem for Josephus are the considerable differences to the stories of Manetho and Chaeremon, which points to the clear falsehood of the narratives. So that is it for Chaeremon and Lysimachus. Now we'll move on to consider whether there is any truth in the account of Manetho in particular, and how we might make sense of these Exodus accounts. So the Exodus accounts of Manetho, or at least of Chaeremon, Lysimachus or Apion, which brandish the Judeans as leprous Egyptians expelled from the land, are obviously composed in such a way to tarnish their reputation. This story also had huge traction within the Greco-Roman world. In fact, the Roman historian Tacitus touches on various views when it comes to the origin of the Jews, but he maintains that most writers agree in stating that once a disease, which horribly disfigured the body, broke out over Egypt, that King Pacorus, seeking a remedy, consulted the oracle of Amun and was bidden to cleanse his realm and to convey into some foreign land this race detested by the gods. Therefore, given the pervasive nature of the story and its degrading intent, Josephus rejects it outright, and he prefers to locate the Exodus in a much earlier period of the Hyksos. For in making this association at least, the Judeans are seen in a much better light, given that the Hyksos ruled over Egypt for a period and are of far greater antiquity. But I think that it's more likely, historically, that the Exodus happened in this later period and not in the earlier period of Hyksos. Although the Hyksos is important, in particular, for understanding the arrival of the Semites in Egypt, such as Joseph and his family. There is then a kernel of truth in Manetho, for Manetho himself relied on his account from the records found in the temple scrolls. He didn't have access to the Hebrew Bible, and although the Septuagint, the Greek Bible, is translated in the 3rd century, it was most likely written after Manetho had composed his Egyptian history. Nonetheless, making sense of Manetho's account is complicated, for he may have conflated the events of the Amarna period with that of the Jewish Exodus. This is what Jan Assmann has argued, finding in the story memory traces of Akhenaten's revolutionary Amarna religion. For some context, Akhenaten introduced monotheism to Egypt in the form of the cult of the sun god, who the Egyptians had already worshipped as a supreme deity, but under Akhenaten there was a prohibition on the worship, rites and festivals of any of the gods apart from Aten. And it's possible that this story can be detected in Manetho, for Sarsith is a monotheist that takes control of Egypt and tries to stamp out the worship of the other gods. In other words, the person of Sarsith in Manetho is Akhenaten, the son of Amenhotep III. For we find in Manetho this historical confusion as he depicts the Ramesses as the successors of Amenhotep III, which is simply not the case. The successor of Amenhotep III is his son Akhenaten and his immediate successors, which include Tutankhamun, the famous tomb of which was found in the 20th century. Only then, after the successors of Akhenaten, does the 19th dynasty begin with the Ramesses. But Akhenaten and his immediate successors were deleted from the king's lists, probably during the Ramesside period, and were called the enemy in archival records. In fact, it wasn't until the 19th century, with the discovery of the city of Amarna, that we knew anything about Akhenaten. As Eric Hornung writes, it seems that Sethos I and Ramesses II were the first to turn actively against Akhenaten and his immediate successors. They were deleted from the king's lists, and the divine names that had been hacked out were restored, as were the representations of Amen. The disruptions unleashed by the reformers were now overcome, and responses were found to his provocations. His reign could thus be thoroughly forgotten. Therefore, given the active elimination of the Egyptian historical records, it was difficult for Manetho to fully comprehend the history of Akhenaten, or even the Jewish Exodus for that matter. But with the apparent overlap of the historical periods and the circumstantial resemblances of monotheism, it was reasonable for him to connect the two events. Nonetheless, there is some historical memory in Manetho of a people who resided in Avaris, did hard labour in the stone quarry, but who eventually left under Ramesses, led by the person of Moses. Modern Egyptologists, at least, such as James Hoffmeyer, Peter Feinum and David Folk, have dated the Exodus to the reign of Ramesses II. In coming up with a possible scenario for the Exodus, I think there are a few points to consider. To begin with, the Joseph story explains the circumstances that the family of Jacob entered Egypt with his flocks and herds as aliens settling in the northeast delta in the land of Goshen. This could very well have happened when the Hyksos were ruling Egypt, for the land of Goshen is perhaps at or near Avaris, the seat of power of the Hyksos kings. Secondly, the Hyksos regime falls around 1540 and Avaris is retaken by the Egyptians under the reign of King Ahmose I. And the book of Exodus describes a radical change in regime when there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, it was thought that after Avaris had been retaken, it was largely abandoned, but it seems more likely that only a selected group of military and political elite were forced out of Egypt, and that the rest of the population of Avaris was enslaved and forced to work on state labour projects. For only prisoners of war could be enslaved, which is what the Hebrews, as well as other Semitic people of Avaris, had now become. Thirdly, the book of Exodus mentions pi-ramesses or Ramesses as one of the store cities built by the Hebrews during their time in Egypt, as it states. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labour. They built supply cities Pithon and Ramesses for Pharaoh. Now, at the beginning of the 19th dynasty, Seti I founded pi-ramesses, the only city with that name, as a royal residence. And Ramesses II expanded the city to become the new capital of Egypt. importantly, this new capital of pi-ramesses is only 2 kilometers away from Avaris, and therefore the Egyptian kings may have built pi-ramesses to keep an eye on the large Semitic population. Lastly then, we find in the archaeological evidence that the city of Avaris is completely abandoned sometime during the 19th dynasty. Moreover, the very first reference to Israel appears in the Victory Stela of Pharaoh Manetho, one of Ramesses' sons. This monument is dated around 1207 BC, which suggests that the rise of Moses and the exodus from Avaris must have happened prior to the reign of Manetho, possibly between 1280 and 1220 BC. Okay, that is it. I think it's worth saying that there's a lot more that could be said on the Exodus, and that this is only a response to Josephus and some of my own thoughts on the matter. So, in the next episode, we'll see Josephus respond to Apion, his longest and most detailed response to an individual opponent, and he will cover 3 main topics: the migration from Egypt, charges against the Judeans in Alexandria, and finally disparagements against the rituals practiced in the Jerusalem temple and the Jewish law. So, thank you for watching, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye!